We're about to enter the 18th century, which was referred to as the Age of Enlightenment. So, a couple of things that are going to come up again in the lecture later on is the Catholic faith is in decline of this time period. In fact, in certain areas, they're being enslaved. The poor are basically trapped in unlivable circumstances, and the rich are ruling with no middle class in sight. The scientific revolution is still happening, and it's interesting because during this time period, science and superstition are in this conflict, in this battle. And in fact, one of the records is a quote unquote vampire epidemic where people from villages claimed they had a vampire problem, and the government sent men in to inspect and sort of fix this problem. So there's a lot of issues and a build up to many revolutions. But before this sort of power shift, there's an art movement, and it's powered mostly by the wealthy. In fact, it's solely powered by the wealthy. And it's called Rococo, which means rocks and shells. So Rococo art is very lavish, it's playful, it's over the top, it's mostly known for its architecture and portraiture. It's one of the three movements to occur during this century. Some defining features of the Rococo movement is the dreamy-like landscape, the pastel colors, the loose brushstrokes, all to create an atmosphere that's more seductive and aesthetic for the wealthy onlookers. Now, this is probably one of the most famous Rococo paintings, and it's a great example of the style and also the time period. It's painted for a baron. It is actually a portrait of the baron's mistress being pushed on a swing by a bishop as requested. Now, the baron is actually in the shrubbery, and one of his arms is extended out towards his mistress's legs, which are flying in the air, actually a shoe coming off in a carefree, playful manner. And the only thing that hints at what's actually going on are the cupids in the actual painting. One has its finger up to its lips as if to tell the onlooker not to sort of gossip, as if to say to keep it a secret. And another cupid is actually looking away in sort of a more gross or abhorrent manner. Now, Rococo didn't focus on the body. It used prior proportions and sort of structures and formats for painting the human body. It really focused on the scenery rather than just the individual. And I'm mostly going over this movement so we can understand the later on movements that will be in reaction to the Rococo painting and sort of the events that are unfolding. So even though they're basically landscapes, there are some portraits that are mostly political in its way. And actually, one political propaganda portrait that we're going to look at is of Marie Antoinette with her children. Now, the Rococo was lavish and extravagant, yet this portrait tones it down. Why, you may be asking? Well, that's because this took place 2 years prior to the French Revolution, and many factors went into the decline of Marie Antoinette's reputation, and this portrait was her last plea to win over her people. Now, Rococo was associated with the wealthy and the lavishing, and she didn't want to have any part of that when she's trying to relate to her people, showing herself not as a ruler, but as a mother. And this was also associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophy, who was a famous philosopher of the time, who believed that women should be tending to the home and the children while the men govern. Now, her daughter in this picture is actually clinging to her, and the eldest son points to an empty carriage as a reminder of her miscarriage and attempts to gain empathy, to no avail. She is later beheaded as a symbol for the revolutionists. And just as a side note, if you notice, the painter was actually, she's female, and during this time period, the French Academy of Art begins to accept women. Now, they only accept 4 women at a time, but it's still very progressive of the time period. Now, the next movement is very much so in reaction against Rococo and the monarchy, and that's neoclassicism. And it has its tight brushstrokes, its roots in ancient Greek or Roman art. It's based on a triangle format, and a great example of this is Jacques-Louis David's Death of Socrates. Now, this scene is taken from classical subject matter of Plato's story about Socrates' death. Socrates, being sentenced to death, convicted of corrupting Athens' youth, he drinks the poison hemlock nobly instead of fleeing. This very much so political portrayal of governmental injustice was relatable to the revolutionists of the time. Now, Socrates' one hand is about to grab the poison, while his other hand gestures up. So, even though the 30-Year War has ended, there's still this conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and the monarchy is associated with the Catholic Church at this time. So the people are actually, they're not even leaning towards Protestant, they're leaning towards secularism. So Socrates' hand is pointing up, referring back to God, but what David does is that he actually refers it back to morals, which many felt the monarchy was lacking. Now, the scene itself is set up like a play, unfolding before us once again. The audience is detached from the work. Now, another work by David is The Death of Marat. Now, Marat was a radical member of the Jacobins, but he was also David's friend. Marat was a journalist, and he often attacked the bourgeoisie, also known as the rising middle class. So we see a middle class now. He was suffering from a severe case of eczema and had lesions all over his body, this causing him to spend more hours in the bathtub. He even worked from his bathtub, where he will be later on murdered by a female named Corday. David's depiction of Marat as a martyr in the revolution is mimicking of the poses of the Pietas from before. Now, this declares his event worthy and equal to the events of the past, while also claiming science over religion. The body again takes on classical canon, stripping it of its disease and depicting him in an idealized body. The muscles painted perfectly, the collarbone under the skin flawlessly, no signs of any lesions. It all demonstrates David's classical understanding of the human body. And the knife on the floor, the stab wound just below the collarbone, and the letter in his hand give the audience all the evidence needed to unfold the story he's trying to tell. At the same time as neoclassicism comes Romanticism, with loose brushstrokes, strong colors, dramatic contrasts, expressive poses, all very reminiscent of the dramatic Baroque period. An example of this is Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare. No longer taking from the ancients, Fuseli creates work from his own imagination, the only exception being the imp on the woman's chest is a reference to old lore of a Mara, or a spirit that would torment sleepers. The horse was a last-minute add-on by Fuseli and might also be a gesture not to a mare but to the Mara. The woman's posture and the creature sitting on her is to give the audience a sense of tension, to encompass the physical experience of pressure and the alarming feeling of needing to breathe. Unlike the playful Rococo or the rational neoclassicism, Romanticism embraced emotion in every aspect. Venturing into the 19th century, there were several empires that collapsed and others that grew. Electronics are sort of first discovered, and the Industrial Revolution takes over the Scientific Revolution. The Victorian era dictates modesty and enforces gender roles on society, and populations double. And medical advances take on a new feat. Sigmund Freud, at the end, actually publishes his theories on dreams and the subconscious. With all of this going on, there is a merging of neoclassicism and romanticism. And in fact, in one of David's students, we see an example of just that. So, what was also happening in France was they were colonizing like crazy and trying to move into Asia in particular. And in order to get people over there, artists enticed men to visit by depicting this alluring, inaccurate narrative known as Orientalization. Now, Ingres shows a female slave to a Turkish sultan turned away in a modest gesture while gazing at us. The fan and hookah with the lavish drapery shows an exoticism of the surroundings. Unlike David, Ingres distorts the body. He elongates the spine to create more vertebrae, widens the hips, and creates a leg that doesn't physically connect properly to any part of her body. That's the leg that's crossing over with the hand on it. Now, if we look at the arms themselves, they seem weak. The bone structure is almost altogether thrown out the window. In a different merging of the styles, we have Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, which shows the neoclassicism pyramid structure but is romantic in subject matter. The telling of a story that was hushed by the newspapers of a ship that crashed. What's interesting about the ship that crashed is there weren't enough lifeboats, and a carpenter on board threw together a raft, and it was tied to the lifeboat that the captain was in. Now, the captain decided that the raft was slowing them down, and they wouldn't be able to make land, and they'd die at sea, so he cut the raft from the boat and made it to shore. Now, out of 115 people on the raft, only 10 survived. They were found 2 weeks after being cut loose. Jericho tries to encompass the corruption of power and chose to depict the moment of the boat being rescued. And he chooses a slave boy at the top of the pyramid waving down their only hope. Now, in contrast, the man in the left corner is in a thinking position, which actually represents cannibalism that occurred, and it's actually due to a surgeon who was also on the raft who suggested that they eat the dying and injured in order to survive. And in fact, one of the people that they will eat is a woman who had a broken leg. Now, he holds the body that comes into our domain, and Jericho actually originally displayed this in his flat with a mirror across the way. So when the audience came in, they didn't see the painting, but rather a reflection of the painting. And the audience would be in the water as a victim of the event, drifting away from hope. Jericho brings the audience physically into his work with such a setup that emotionally got their minds turning in thought. The last artist we are going to look at of the Romantic movement is Goya. Now, Goya is from Spain, and he produced incredibly diversely themed works. Unfortunately, Goya will struggle with both physical and mental health, but before that really takes place, he creates this commissioned work. And it's the first Spanish female nude not of a goddess, but of an ordinary woman. Her arms are behind her head, and she stares at the viewer head on, exposing herself entirely. Her proportions suggest that she was not painted from a model, although many historians have theories about who the model was. Now, the Spanish Inquisition is still happening, so a clothed version of the nude was made in order to hide the nude in certain circumstances, since it wasn't allowed during the time. Eventually, it is found, and Goya will have to go to court and sort of defend the painting. In one of his later works, in particular from his Dark series, Goya distorts and contorts the figure. In Saturn devouring his children, we see the loose brushstrokes of the Romantic paintings and a gruesome telling from Roman mythology. Saturn, the god of time, in order to stop the prophecy of his son killing him, decides to eat all of his children, which inadvertently causes his son to kill him. The distorted body fades into the background, suggesting only the appearance of flesh and manic eyes staring at us as the limp body in Saturn's clenching hands gets torn apart. A gruesome story to behold. And there are more artistic shifts that occur after Romanticism. Photography is actually invented during this time. Pre-Raphaelite movement happens, but what we're really going to be analyzing is a movement called realism. Now, realism denounced both neoclassicism and romanticism, particularly in France after the Revolution in 1848. This inspired artists to turn to the poor, everyday individual for inspiration. Millet famously paints three women bent over gathering leftover grain after a harvest in the painting The Gleaners. Another realist we're going to be looking at is Manet, not to be confused with Monet, who comes later. So, we've seen many nude females, but we're going to compare the Venus of Urbino and the realist version that's titled Olympia by Manet. Now, Manet looked at Titian's painting for inspiration, but took on an entirely new meaning. Titian's tells the story of a good wife on display for her husband. Manet paints a prostitute, declaring that even though she sells her body, she is not owned by any man. The cat at her feet mimics the dog, only unlike fertility and loyalty, the cat again reminds the viewer that she is a prostitute. Her hand tells us that she is in control of the situation, and her servant, or more likely slave, offers her flowers, probably from a customer, but they are positioned out towards us. Now, if we look at the flowers themselves, they are flat, as if a sort of portrait on the fabric. And in general, in contrast to Titian's, Manet's is flat overall. And his female nude is so pale that many believe she appeared dead or ill. Although both are anatomically accurate, Titian's is soft and rounded, while Manet's is sharp and angular in structure. Heading over into America emerges Thomas Eakins, who was well educated in both art and anatomy, which led to his Gross Clinic portraits, which were greatly rejected due to the fact that people did not consider the subject matter of surgery art. It captures Dr. Gross in the middle of his new surgery for bone infections. We only see the leg being worked on by his assistants, his hand holding a bloodied scalpel as he turns to students to discuss the groundbreaking new method to saving ligaments that otherwise would have been amputated. Now, a woman who is supposedly the mother, possibly, but is related to the individual, is distraught with emotion in the corner. Unlike Rembrandt, Eakins is depicting an actual event and demonstrates a breakthrough for the medical world. Surgeries prior were never part of the healing process until Gross experimented and explored. Even though it was poorly received, he continued to paint surgeries. Here is depicted a portrait of a mastectomy, or partial mastectomy. With less blood, it still wasn't well received. His accurate surgical subject matter left many uncomfortable, and several claimed it not for the weak of stomach. Some claimed that it made them sick seeing him, and others said it was indecent to portray a female nude in such a manner. The odd thing is that even being accurate and supposedly gruesome, the body is never the focal point. The doctor is always highlighted. the body itself is actually usually covered or partially contorted. You're not seeing the entirety of the body being worked on. Even still, the body and the surgery is still portrayed in an accurate manner, even if cut and cropped. Now, in 1841, tins of oil paint was invented, which allowed artists to explore and paint outdoors readily instead of grinding homemade pigments indoors. This led to Impressionism and artists' desires to capture the fleeting effects of light on the landscape. Monet is a famous Impressionist, as well as Renoir, but we are going to look at Degas. His desire to capture movement, and it was seen as, well, Impressionism in general was seen as unfinished. But what really is interesting in Degas is his angled vantage point and sort of the cropping of figures, particularly the female on the left, cut down the center. His figures alone are not anatomically striking like the Renaissance, but rather capture the emotion of a body in movement, hazed like in a dream. He started painting ballerinas as a study of the human muscles movement in repetition. After working so closely with ballerinas, he created a sculpture leaning on the realism spectrum. Now, dancers often came from poor families and dressed in what was considered exposing clothes. They were often preyed on by men and needed guardians to protect them. And Degas saw their troubles and chose to depict the dancer with a melancholy expression. And her arms are forced behind her and her legs in a ballet position, I should say. It's revolutionary for sculpture as he used a real bodice and a real tutu and ballet slippers and even real hair. When shown, she was called ugly and portrayed too realistic. Now, in next week, I'll cover post-impressionism and the early 20th century. And I stopped here because even though we're kind of stopping on impressionism, post-impressionism really blends and continues into the 20th century. So I felt like it would be a really good sort of backtrack into what we're learning right now and this merging into what's to come of the next sort of century covered.